Well, welcome everyone. This is Joanne Geer. I'm the Executive Director for the Westchester Biotech Project, and we are very pleased to share this webinar with you. This is our rare disease update on repurposing drugs through computational biology. We'll be meeting with Dr. Bruce Bloom and Dr. Molina-Pachon in a moment. I just want to share with you a little bit about us. We launched in the spring of 2017. And since then, we've had about 30 programs of various kinds, webinars, roundtables, symposia, and so on. We are located and focused on Westchester County, New York, which is just north of New York City. And like everybody in the world today, anybody who's doing life science work in our region is collaborating nationally and internationally. And so that's really we call ourselves borderless because we're really looking at how we can have an impact globally. Let's see, I think, Dr. Bloom, can you mute yourself? I think that's you. Well, I'll introduce you in a second. Thank you very much. So we have several different kinds of ongoing programs, and we'll be doing similar activities next year. I'm not going to go into detail about these, but we're happy to get you involved if there's something that intrigues you. Some of the events are definitely in person. They can happen in a lot of different places, including at your place if you like. A lot of them are also online, so it's very easy to invite people to collaborate. We can do this because of the partnership of wonderful community partners, universities, colleges and universities around our region and beyond, as well as our alliance partners like BioInc and COIN in North Carolina. You can find us all different kinds of ways, and I will just share, if you take a look for us on YouTube, Chris Kinzel, who many of you have communicated with, is our program coordinator. He's just done a really nice job of reworking our archive on YouTube. So it's a lot of really great webinars, recordings available there. You can also get to them through our website. They're linked in a number of places. And so I now introduce Dr. Bruce Bloom, who is the CEO at Cures Within Reach. Dr. Bloom, I'm going to make you the presenter, and you'll get a pop-up to show your screen. Thank you. Perfect.
Hang on.
Dr. Bloom, while you're just getting started, I will share with everyone if to please keep yourself muted, and please enter your questions in the chat box on the side of your screen. We will let Dr. Bloom make his presentation, and we'll all learn a lot, and then we'll go back into the questions and have a nice discussion. We'll have plenty of time for that. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction, and I'm pleased to be here and share this information with everybody that's on the webinar today. So I'm going to be talking about mostly drug repurposing, but also some device and nutraceutical repurposing with a focus on how computational biology is helping us in this space. So we're all probably aware of the problem that there are 7,000 plus unsolved rare diseases, and they affect a lot of people around the world. There's few new therapies that are developed each year, and when there is, they're very expensive. They take a long time to bring to patients, and they don't always work for every patient. And so we need to find other solutions. And one solution that we've been working on is what we call rare purposing. So repurposing for rare diseases. And many people, at least here in the States and many other countries, know this little book of The Little Engine That Could. And it's really sort of indicative of how we think of repurposing and rare purposing. It's a really great thing, but it has needs a lot of energy to get up and over the hill and onto patients. So we're going to be talking about that today. And I just wanted to start to make sure that we're all on the same page to review some definitions that we use, because there isn't really standard nomenclature in the industry around repurposing. So when I'm talking today about repurposing, for the most part, I will be talking about finding a new use in a rare disease for a drug, device, nutraceutical already approved for human use. There's also something we call rare positioning, which would be finding a new rare indication for a human-safe pipeline compound. So something going through a pharmaceutical development that's been proven safe for humans, but is being repurposed within the development stage. We don't, as Cures Within Reach, work on those very often because they're still very time-consuming and that they are very expensive and take a long time to get to patients. We also work both in the commercial and the philanthropic area. About 80% of what we do is purely philanthropic, where we're using philanthropic funds to support a clinical trial to validate whether a repurposed therapy can work for patients in a rare disease. By the way, at Cures Within Reach, we don't only work on rare diseases, but it is a significant portion of the work that we do. We also have some work that we do in the commercial sector where we are value added along the commercial development and then hand those projects off to other companies that will take them to market. There's, as many of you can imagine, there's lots of advantages to rare purposing. There are thousands of molecules that are already available for human use, either as drugs or nutraceuticals. And I want to make clear at the beginning, when I'm talking about nutraceuticals, I'm talking about compounds that are utilized by humans that have strong biological action in the body, some of which are as or more potent than drugs in the human body, but they've just never been approved by any regulatory agency as a drug for any particular disease indication. But they're still as useful in solving diseases as are any drug. Repurposing can attack almost any disease. It provides strong evidence-based outcomes and is really fast and effective. The research is often really inexpensive compared to de novo research. What's interesting about repurposing is that sometimes you can move directly to a clinical trial even before you know what the potential mechanism of action might be, because in our world, we don't care if we know the mechanism of action as long as we know that it helps the patients lead a healthier life. So for a lot of our work, the primary endpoint is publishing a robust clinical trial set of data and then allowing physicians to decide, is that data strong enough for off-label use with their patients? There's also a 505(b)(2) accelerated pathway for commercial development of repurposing, and we have currently 5 projects going through that 505(b)(2) accelerated pathway. That's all good news. The bad news is that there's really no economic incentive for a lot of the repurposing that could be used in rare diseases. Partly because generic drugs are cheap and widely available. Even if you could get an MOU patent to support your specific use in a rare disease, it would be very hard to enforce, and people would just substitute the generic for your, maybe branded product. Often we're able to repurpose in the same dose and delivery method that the current drug is in, and oftentimes we could change the dosage to try and get new composition of matter IP, but that doesn't always meet the primary endpoint for the kinds of things that we're trying to do. If you look historically, and these are not Cures Within Reach successes, but if you look historically at some of the repurposing that is done in the world, you can see that there's quite a few repurposing things that are used by physicians right now that are for rare diseases. And one I like to point out here, in multiple sclerosis, this repurposing of dimethyl fumarate called Tecfidera this is one of the most profitable drugs on the market, and it's totally a repurposing project. There's a lot of repurposing out there. We have 30 new projects in the last 3 years that we've initiated, and many of them are in rare diseases. We currently have 24 projects in our portfolio, most of which are clinical trials validating a new use for an old drug. And we launched 6 requests for proposals in 2018 so far, including rare disease, retinitis pigmentosa, Meniere's disease, and several different kinds of rare blood cancers. So I want to talk a little bit about our successes. We've funded more than 60 repurposing clinical trials, and the result of that is 13 new repurposed therapies that are either being used off-label by physicians, 8 of them in rare diseases, and 3 of those projects are on their way to commercialization. One of our projects just submitted to the FDA for a device approval, and we should know sometime in the first quarter of 2019. We're very frugal. Our average trial cost is under $200,000, and our average trial timeline from initiating the trial to when publication could prove that something is valuable to patients is less than 3 years. So we're very efficient and effective. We might be one of the most efficient pharmaceutical companies in the world. If you think of us, you know, we've done all this work in a little bit over $6 million. So compared to the cost of de novo therapy, these kinds of repurposed therapies are really inexpensive and you can quickly get to patients. I know there's a lot of words on this, and these slides will be available to you if you want to see the details, but I just want to point out a couple of things that is important. So this is a disease called Autoimmune Lymphoproliferative syndrome. It's a disease where kids have white blood cells that don't die, and they build up in the body and crowd out all the healthy spaces, and eventually these kids die. And we funded a mouse trial and then a human clinical trial, and so all the way down to getting patients impacted broadly around the world. This is now the go-to therapy for refractory autoimmune lymphoproliferative syndrome. And he has raised lots of money and done this on a bunch of other diseases here. And so it was a huge success for us, not only making these kids healthier, but significantly reducing the cost of care for all of these kids. On average, their cost of care goes down by almost $100,000 a year. So improved outcomes and reduced cost is the holy grail of medical research, and we've been able to do that in several of these diseases. And here's a similar case, but interesting, this one is all nutraceuticals. Again, nutraceuticals aren't less effective than drugs, they're just never been approved. And so this lab that we funded for several years has now found 5 different nutraceuticals that in combination helps kids with the disease familial dysautonomia go on to lead healthy lives. Basically, these kids used to die typically under the age of 6. And this lab found out what the gene defect was, what pathways it was impacting, and using a combination of these nutraceuticals was able to upregulate the gene and change a splicing defect. So now we can get these kids up to 100% of the protein that they were normally missing. And again, saving significant healthcare costs in the meantime. So these are some of our current opportunities, and the arrows indicate which ones are rare diseases, and Batten disease, Huntington's disease, pediatric brain tumors, 2 of those, and then pediatric cancers, rare pediatric cancers, more brain tumor, a certain kind of lung cancer, and a couple of other rare diseases. So while it's not a primary focus of us, it tends to be where we see patients because they're not going to get support typically from the pharmaceutical industry. So I want to shift the gears now because the focus of this was on computational biology, and here's what we're seeing out in the marketplace, that rare purposing is winning, and we're getting over the hill and beginning to deliver some of these rare repurposed therapies to patients, but we want to do more. And so what we end up with using computational biology is more like this. So, here's our new streamlined rare purposing engine to get us where we want to go in the world of rare purposing. So I'm going to take you through some examples of some of the companies that we're working with that are doing some really interesting things around repurposing and rare purposing. So as a background, a lot of the computational biology, artificial intelligence, machine learning helping us.
Excuse me, Dr. Bloom. Excuse me, Dr. Bloom. We seem to have a network issue. So I'm just going to ask you to start again on this slide.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Sure. So as a background to the kind of work that computational biology, artificial intelligence, machine learning is having on repurposing and rare purposing, I want to, I think that as we've done in the past, most of what we've done is copy de novo drug development. Think about the different phases going from, lab to animal, animal to human, human to larger trials, and that works great. But if we can cut some of those steps out by using artificial intelligence methods, we can be faster, cheaper, and have greater success rates. Second thing that's happening is we're moving from small and large scale trials to sometimes just even N of 1 trials because of the precision medicine that we're able to do. We're able to go from single drug therapies to combo therapies, and artificial intelligence and computational biology is helping us figure how we might do that. And the fourth thing that's changing is, especially in diseases like cancers and things that are progressive or will change over time, we're going from a static therapy, which is something we use till it stops working and then shift to something else, to a more dynamic therapy where we keep modifying, we keep testing to stay ahead of the disease. And artificial intelligence, genetics and genomics and proteomics is helping us to do more of that kind of work so we can be more effective. We can still utilize the benefits of existing drugs, devices, and nutraceuticals, but we can use them in a different way to get to patients more quickly, to get to different segments of a patient population that might not otherwise get a successful outcome by knowing what's going on with them. So these are some of the computational methods that people are using out there to help with repurposing. And by the way, everything that's helping with repurposing is also helping with de novo drug development. But it's interesting to know that that both of those kinds of therapy development regimens can benefit from this kind of work. So these aren't in any particular order of importance, but they're just listing a number of ways that computational biology companies or academic labs or government divisions are doing the work that they're doing around computational biology. One of the interesting things for us is to see how some of these groups are able to take their are doing one of these or two of these things, and how over the years coming up, we think that groups will start doing multiple of these things at the same time. And some big company is likely to do a roll-up of a number of these things so that you can get even more specific. It takes a lot of computational power. It takes a significant amount of money. And maybe the most important thing in all of this is that it's important to make sure you have accurate data going in. So for a lot of these things, we're using large databases, and I'll show you some of those in a minute. If you have data that are not accurate on the input, then you end up with data that are not accurate on the output. The old garbage in, garbage out analogy is really important here. And what we see is that some of these companies on the right that we've worked with, and lots of others that we haven't worked with, are realizing how important it is to scrub and curate the data that they get so that it's much more accurate on the way in, so that they can rely more importantly on the data on the way out. So here's some of the companies, large and small, on the right side of the screen that we've worked with. We worked with 3 different divisions at IBM. So there's IBM Watson, there's IBM Research, and there's IBM in general, all of whom are using computational methods in biology in one way or another. There's a couple of small companies like Cyclica, which is a Canadian company that I'll describe in a minute, BioVista, which is a US-based company, Helix, which is Cambridge, UK, notable labs out in San Francisco, 13 Biotech, which is a spin out of Weill Cornell in New York. And then you see 3 of the academic institutions that are sort of leading the pack in what they're doing as far as using computational biology, and we'll look at some of those. So this is one of the first companies, and just for a disclosure, I do sit on the science advisory board of 13 Biotech, Helix. I do some mentoring at notable labs, so I'll mention those as I say these. I don't have any financial interest in any of these companies, but just to know that I do know a bit about them and have been coaching them and working with them. So this is a spin out from Weill Cornell, using a wide variety of public and private databases and creating their own algorithmic methods to do some of the things that you see on the left side. Really interesting that they continue to find different ways of using these data to do some work, and it's great to see the accuracy levels that they're having on the right side. You know, some of these accuracies are derived from looking backwards at data, and if you were blinded and had done, pulled in all the data and then used your algorithm, would you have come up with the same results that we know have been validated through de novo therapy or clinical research? And so these are pretty high numbers considering how early on we are in the world of computational biology. So this is one company, again, a young sort of startup company that's just beginning to do some of its work, working with some pharmaceutical companies. And here's an example of one of the things that they were able to do. So they used some genomic data to look at combination therapies, and what they found was that the drug imatinib, which is also known as Gleevec, was really important as a potential synergistic combination with another drug in order to make that drug work a lot better. And interestingly, over the last 4 or 5 years, imatinib has come to the forefront as a drug that is being repurposed in so many different indications, from things as far apart as cancer and tuberculosis, rare diseases, and very common chronic diseases. So it's not surprising that it came up in the in this screen using this kind of combination data. And so now this particular indication is being tested in the lab to see how it works. Here's another company, Notable Labs, using computational biology in a much different way. They have a flow cytometry system that will take individual patient samples and run them through an automatic lab system that tests them against all sorts of repurposed therapies, both alone and in combination. And what they're able to do is provide back within 4 days of receiving the sample back to the physician a list of combinations of existing drugs that look like they should be helpful in the patient's disease. And they're having really significant success in pediatric leukemias, especially in kids that are so far down the therapeutic journey that there's no therapy left for them, no conventional therapy left. And the combinations that they've been able to provide through the system have pulled those patients back towards health far enough that they could be eligible for a stem cell transplant, which could be curative. So it's pretty amazing and very inexpensive, very fast. And this is the kind of precision medicine that I think is going to be a big part of our future. And it's not expensive to do the testing. You don't need a large sample. It certainly works much more easily in a disease like a blood cancer, where you can get lots of cells at one time. Harder to do in a small solid tumor, but we'll figure out how to do that. It's a company in Cambridge called Helix that is totally focused on rare diseases and using a whole bunch of different kinds of computational biology to make an impact on patient lives. So here's a list of all of the things that they use. in order to help them refine and determine the kinds of things that they're doing, and ending up with these sort of opportunities on the right side of the screen. And I was just at a conference in London for a rare disease that is around the gene CDKL5, and Helix, in a period of about 90 days, was able to use their biological system in order to determine a drug that looked like it could be helpful in this genetic disease, rare genetic disease, and it was tested first in a mouse model and then in humans really quickly, and it looks like it's working. And this was all done just using computational biology. And so it's an example of the kind of speed, low cost, and accuracy you can get in doing the kind of work. This company does a tremendous amount of work scrubbing and curating the data that goes into these things in order to make sure that the results they get on the back end can be successful. And so this is an indication of the kind of system that they use, where they start with where we don't know much about the disease, and they start learning all sorts of stuff, and the system learns. Then they use patient-specific and disease-specific omics to start building a database. They optimize it through artificial intelligence using some digital biomarkers and patient stratification, and then out the back end, they can get some really important and effective therapies. And the picture that they like to use is this, where we're just touching the surface of the kinds of things that we'll be able to do eventually, kind of like an iceberg, where most of this is still hidden to us. But as we continue to develop different kinds of ways of gathering data and stratifying it, we're going to be able to do much more in this particular world. I want to move over to one of the academic centers. This is at Vanderbilt University here in the States, and they have realized that using phenotypic screening, they can find a single nucleotide in the genome that might be indicative of health or disease. So instead of having to do the old-fashioned way from labs to animals to humans, you can cut short and say, we already have a proxy for that. We can go straight to target validation and human success. Much quicker and a much higher success rate. And so this is the kind of things that they use. They do this phenome-wide analysis, use all sorts of data that are already generated, and then they use their electronic health records and genetic data that they have from actual patients to do some precision indications about this. And they're able to move incredibly quickly in this. And they have 2.5 million clinical samples that they're used to validate this stuff. And so, here's an indication about how they moved straight to human testing when the repurposed drug was really safe. And so this is now in clinical trial. So, in less than 18 months, they went from not knowing anything about this disease to having a clinical trial started, mostly because they were using existing data through an artificial intelligence system that they had built. And the last one that I want to talk about is a company called Cyclica up in Canada. And they're doing more in silico development and using the shape of molecules in order to help us design kinds of new therapies, either new therapies or drug repurposing. And they've been able to do some really important work. And one of the things that I think is important to point out is that a lot of what artificial intelligence could do is not only tell us what might work, like drug repurposing, but also start to tell us what off-site impact that the drug's going to have, which would cause the adverse effects. And so you can either pick the best candidate from among a bunch of candidates, or you can even think of what else might I be able to give that would offset these adverse effects. And artificial intelligence is helping us to do some of that. So they can do, validation for an orphan disease, and we worked with them on this and the people at Tulane University. So, we were working with a couple of diseases, including systemic scleroderma, where they were able to validate and publish just based on the conformational shape of the molecules and the receptor and figure out what might work. And this was a very short timeline to go from, we have a novel testable link to a prediction of what might work. And then I just want to point out some other interesting thing that's going on in the AI world. There's a company out there called Aravale, and basically this is to help be not only your wellness coach, but that help you figure out how to take care of your prevent and take care of your diseases. So they'll be gathering patient-specific information and then combining it with hopefully hundreds of thousands of people that join, so we can start to see how food, injury, all sorts of things going on in our body, including our microbiome, might help us to live healthier, less expensive lives. And so lots of people are starting to use AI and repurposing out in the real world, not just in the research world. So some predictions that we have, that we're going to see each year a doubling or more of the impact of repurposed drugs. And I think in the future, AI is going to get so good that on an individual basis, we'll know exactly what the targets are of individual people's diseases, but we won't have a way of doing de novo drug development instantaneously. And so the things that we'll be able to rely on to make people healthier are drugs, devices, and nutraceuticals that already exist for human use. I also think that we'll turn some acute rare diseases into chronic manageable diseases through precision medicine, and it'll be interesting to see how we do clinical trials 10 years from now, because it seems like it'll be hard to find homogeneous populations because everybody's genome will be just a little different. And so it's going to be a very interesting world as we continue to move forward. It'll be, I'm particularly interested to see how regulatory authorities and pharmaceutical companies decide how to do de novo drug development, because that's going to be critical for our success. We can't only rely on repurposing, but how we're going to structure those kinds of clinical trials. So this is the team that we have at Cures Within Reach, and I want to stop now and open it up for whatever questions people have.
Thank you, Dr. Bloom. There is someone who Glenetta, I'm going to ask you to mute your phone if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Hang on just a moment. I will be. We got a little bit of background. Well, thank you, everybody. This is Joanne Geer again, and so we have a couple of questions to get started with, but first I'd like to introduce Dr. Antonio Molina-Pachon. Antonio, would you like to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your project that the Rare Disease Hub we're all working on, and share your thoughts about Dr. Bloom's presentation, and then we'll open up for further discussion.
Sure. Well, I am an entrepreneur in the biotech industry. I have been working with rare diseases for the last 9-10 years. And I come from Europe, from Spain, and in the last year, more or less, we have been moving all our projects from Europe, from Spain, and some things that we did in Switzerland. We're moving them to the US. We are basically focused on New York now, except for a small company that we have in San Francisco. And I am really, I have been collaborating with Joan and Michael and with the Westchester Biotech Project for a year and a half in the rare diseases. And this presentation today is, is really exciting. To me, I've seen how the approach to putting drugs in the market is changing in the last 4 or 5 years. Is really exciting. It is almost unbelievable. it's very discouraging and heartbreaking when you see patients, in particular children, pediatric patients, when you see them, suffering from some of these devastating rare diseases, and there is nothing that the physician can offer to the kid or to the parents. So all this work, all this research, all this revolution in this market, I think is extremely exciting, and I plan to bombard Dr. Bloom for the next 20 or 30 years with a bunch of questions and proposals for projects and stuff. It's really, really exciting, everything that I just learned today. And I wrote here 23 different questions, but I know Joanne, and she will kill me if I take too much time.
I think
So
22 has to be your limit.
I'll focus on some general ones that I think that might be of interest for other people in the audience too. First of all, Dr. Bloom, congratulations. Really, you are filling a void in this market, in this whole development value chain. You are filling a void that is there, and it's a painful one. So bringing things that are really advanced or already there, bringing them to new diseases and patients suffering from those new diseases is really, really needed. I have a general question to start with. From the patient point of view, from the market point of view, if the goal is to have more drugs available for these patients, the fact that when you repurpose a drug, the IP is really weak or non-existent, because the generic is there and stuff, is that like a bottleneck in all these projects? To finally bring more drugs to the market?
Thanks, Antonio. Yes, it's the biggest impediment to drug repurposing is that there's no economic incentive most of the time to repurpose generic drugs that could help unsolved diseases. So if you could imagine, if we could repurpose aspirin for lupus, for example, that would be great for lupus patients. They could go to the chemist or the drugstore, and for $3 a month they could have a therapy. But nobody in the aspirin market would spend the money to get it approved, which could be, as much as $40 to $80 million for the size of the clinical trials. So Cures Within Reach and others are out there trying to figure out new economic engines that could help this. For example, in England, we're working with the National Health Service to try and create what we call outcome-based financing for drug repurposing. And in an outcome-based financing situation, we'd raise private funds to do the clinical trials. And for every success that we had that made patients healthier and reduced healthcare costs, the payer, which would be the English government, would give us a portion of the savings, which we would use to repay the investors. And so we create a brand new system along with the conventional pharmaceutical system that could help with funding these kinds of things. So it's interesting. One of the questions that came up here was around that I could see. I think Chris had a question about that. Do I expect costs to decrease? In almost all cases where drug repurposing takes place, you end up with improved outcomes and decreased costs. And so we need to figure out ways of tapping into those decreased costs so that we can provide affordable outcomes for patients.
So do you foresee a market, the next, let's say, 5 years, a market where very small companies with, let's say, like big portfolios of drugs, each one giving let's say, a small profit, could enter the market? Do you think that the big companies will stay away from this market for these reasons, and so there will be a kind of small market niche for very small and ad hoc companies?
I think there will be. We know about a dozen companies out there that are interested in repurposing, that are working on the assumption that they're going to be able to make a small profit. You know, what is small to one company might be different than to another company, but you know, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you have a drug that might make you $20 million a year, you're not going to pay any attention to it. That's not big enough. But if you're a small biotech and could get out there and have a drug that, you know, if you invest $10 to $20 million in it and could get a return of $20 million a year, that might work. And so we know a bunch of different companies, Rediscovery Life Sciences, Audacity, Therapeutics, and several others, thinking about how do we take these potentially profitable, sort of low profit chemicals to the, you know, drugs to the market for repurposing. Okay. There are lots of ways. If we had more time, and I'm happy to come back and do this at another time and talk about all the potential economic incentives for drug repurposing, but there's about a dozen ways that we can create economic incentive for the repurposing of drugs. Lots of them require things like legislative or regulatory changes in order for that to happen. But I also think some of the payers are starting to look at repurposing as a potential way of reducing their costs as well.
Okay. Changing the subject a little bit, you sparked my curiosity and my imagination mentioning nutraceuticals. Can you define, I didn't understand very well, what you mean by nutraceuticals from a, let's say, biological/chemical point of view?
Sure. What I'm talking about is things that we might refer to as vitamins or minerals, things that you would buy in the States at some place like General Nutrition Center. So, you know, vitamin A, EGCG, some of these, they're powerful chemicals, but they've just never been approved any place in a regulatory authority as a drug. So the difference between, you know, aspirin, which is started out as a sort of what I would call a biological medicine. You know, it comes from the bark of a tree. Eventually, somebody got it approved as a drug, and there's a standard dose, and there's all sorts of health claims. But if you want to take vitamin E, for example, as a therapeutic, you can go buy that any place you want, and you can self-dose. You don't know necessarily you're getting the same dosage. It's not regulated like a drug. But in the body, vitamins, minerals, and other what I would call nutraceutical chemicals have strong biological impact. And in that familial dysautonomia example, it's amazing. There's a certain vitamin E that actually changes the splicing defect of a misshaped protein so that it works. And so it's just as effective as any other drug that you could give that would do the same thing. So we think of them sort of interchangeably. The upside of nutraceuticals is they're inexpensive and widely available. The downside is they're not regulated as well, so you don't know from pill to pill, dose to dose, and company to company whether you're getting the same dosage that you expect. Whereas with drugs, it's more expensive, more highly regulated, but also more consistent.
Okay.
I'd like to open it up. We have several people who've introduced some great questions here, and we have a small enough group today that we can invite you to unmute yourself. Kevin, would you like to go first? You had a couple of different questions. You want to ask the most burning one? Feel free to introduce yourself as well. We have Kevin. Sometimes it take a while to get oneself.
You know, I can see Kevin's questions.
Okay. Well, let's see if Matthew Burkhardt is available, because it'd be nice to hear someone else's voice ask a question. Matthew.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I think the most pertinent question I have is really from an example that took place a couple of years ago, where deflazacort was a repurposed drug and applied to DMD patients. The company that developed it took it through regulatory decided to price it at $89,000 per year when it was publicly available for $1,000 per year previously. How do you think those types of for-profit repurposing strategies are going to evolve to be able to demonstrate a perhaps avoid a public reaction to the cost that may be associated with taking a repurposed drug into regulatory approval?
Yeah, Matthew, it's a great question, and that's a really powerful example. So here's what I would say about it. Right now, the rules that are in place allow a company like Marathon to bring deflazacort to market and charge whatever they want. That's, in order for that to change, we're going to have some kind of regulatory change, because at least in the US, we allow that to happen. And whether it's a good thing or a bad thing I don't have an opinion on. It's just the way it is. It's the same thing with de novo medicines. When somebody brings those to market, they pretty much can price it at whatever they think the market will bear. And because of that, many of these new therapies are incredibly expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So my guess is that as we continue to do this, if Congress can ever, at least here in the US, if Congress can ever move forward, they will, and we'll begin to see some regulatory authorities. Interesting, I'll give you an example similar to this. Over in England, so there's a drug called Lucentis, which is approved for macular degeneration, and it's an effective drug. It turns out that the generic drug Avastin is, at least in clinical trials, as effective as Lucentis and costs about 1/20th of the cost. And so in both Italy and England, the government has started paying for Avastin instead of Lucentis, and the company that makes Lucentis sued the government. And at least in the lower court in England, they held that the government could pay the lower cost for Avastin and not have to pay for the approved drug. Avastin's not approved for AMD, macular degeneration. So I think you're going to start to see people taking more control of this, because, Matthew, as you say, it becomes unaffordable for a lot of people to be able to utilize a drug like deflazacort, which did have good impact in DMD.
Well, thank you. Alan Belicha, are you available to ask your question? Feel free to introduce yourself. How you doing?
Hi, Joanne.
Hi.
Dr. Bloom, that was quite interesting, and I'm very interested in this topic. A question I have for you is whether there is something that the technology transfer offices more generally, maybe those that don't have the resources of the bigger ones, can do in order to advance some of these repurposing opportunities, based on my somewhat limited experience, that many times a disclosure is made for such a repurposing use, and the technology transfer office ultimately closes that case because they do not have the resources to pursue this type of commercialization event, because there's no strong IP behind it. So is there something that technology transfer offices could do broadly to try to advance some of these opportunities?
That's another excellent question. Thanks, Alan. So the answer is yes, there are things that both the inventor and the tech transfer office could do if they choose to spend their money that way in doing that. And for example, we know dozens of repurposing opportunities where somebody has slightly changed the dosage, method of delivery, done a combination, taken a drug that's usually taken orally and turned it into an inhalant or a topical. But those things then start to slide into sort of a hybrid of repurposing and de novo development. And you have to find a tech transfer office that's willing to both be sort of visionary in seeing how this could develop some good protectable intellectual property, and also to think of how they're going to fund those kinds of things. Out in the world of venture and other kinds of financing, these kinds of repurposed therapies are still not seen as wildly profitable. And so if you're a venture capitalist, you might put your money into a de novo therapy with really strong IP, even though it's less likely to be successful than this kind of a repurposed drug that has some IP, but might end up having some generic substitution. An example of what you just said, if everybody remembers back to the beginning of the drug Sildenafil, which turned into Viagra, it was a failed blood pressure medication, but it worked for erectile dysfunction. It turned out it also works for pulmonary arterial hypertension. And in order to protect the IP, the company Pfizer went ahead and changed the dosage on the pill, and tested the new pill in a way that you couldn't have taken a Viagra pill and cut it in half to match. And so they tried to eliminate the kind of generic substitution that might be possible. We have, as I said, about a dozen different ways we could think of that you could incentivize the repurposing of these things from technology transfer offices, like differential pricing, companion diagnostic tests, combination drugs, different kinds of therapeutic offerings. So there are ways to do it, but it's complicated and it takes money and it takes vision. And right at the moment, I think it's kind of difficult.
Thank you. I'm getting a sense of a topic area might be very interesting to this group. I think, Kevin, you may be available now. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Hi.
Great. So my name is Kevin Friard. I have a small company called Salem Oaks, and we're out to teach people who aren't in the industry how drugs get developed. And I happen to be on that Viagra team that you were talking about when I was at Pfizer, the original Viagra team. But I was wondering if you guys have looked at compounds or agents that have failed in their efficacy trials in the primary indication and been dropped by the companies, but they might still have utility in a rare condition.
We have, and many of our researchers are looking at those kinds of things. Cures Within Reach as a company, as a nonprofit company, doesn't pursue those unless a funder asks us to, because it's still de novo development and longer and more expensive than we're able to raise money for. But there's lots of opportunity out there in the failed compound world. And one of the things I described earlier, this kind of outcome-based financing, if we could get that to work, we could resurrect a lot of failed compounds that no longer have intellectual property and might be difficult to bring to market. We could bring those in a new way. But Kevin, it's a huge market out there. And when we first started doing repurposing about 10 years ago, there was no pharmaceutical company that would work with us on this. And today, every major pharmaceutical company has their own internal division doing repurposing, either of their branded compounds or, as you mentioned here, of their failed, stalled, deprioritized compounds, looking to utilize the asset that they've already paid for and move it to market in one way or another. So, and you probably know this, but both NCATs at the NIH and over in England at the MRC have programs, governmental funded programs, primarily designed to take these kinds of failed compounds, put them back out into the market, and have academic researchers propose projects that could move them to the market in a new indication. And they've been fairly successful in both the NIH and the MRC program in doing that.
Thank you. Chris, I think you have a question. Would you like to ask it now?
Hey, I think Bruce, hi, I'm Chris Kinsley. I'm the program coordinator here at the Westchester Biotech Project. And I think Bruce touched on it a little bit earlier. It was just in the sense, so I think I like to think bigger picture. So this discussion, all of this, the big thought that it raises in my head is affordable healthcare. And there's a sense of scare in my mind that pharma doesn't really want that to ever be an option. Could this, in a sense, force lower drug prices, even if, I mean, we kind of touched on it already. That's kind of where my head went.
Yeah, Chris, it's a really great question. And, you know, for those of us on the call that work with or in the pharmaceutical industry, I would say the vast majority of those people don't really want to have huge high drug prices. But the way we have the system set up, it's almost impossible as a pharmaceutical company not to create and utilize all of the opportunities that the regulatory authority and the market give you. So my hope is that, you know, we'll figure out some way of rewarding pharmaceutical companies in a different way than allowing them to charge whatever price they want. But in the meantime, that's what it has. That's what we have. I do think that we're going to start to see companies come out, as Matthew asked about, you know, the deflazacort kinds of things, that there'll be lots of companies, and Alan asked the same question about, will people be able to bring lower cost repurposing and still make a small profit on it? And will that, you know, drive the market? And here's the issue that I think we all have to look at. There's 12,000 unsolved diseases out there. There's only about 500 diseases that have a really strong curative or highly successful, you know, drug therapy. And so even if we, you know, ramp this up in a huge way, we're not going to be able to get to all 12,000 of those diseases, whether we're the pharmaceutical industry or the repurposing industry. But I do think the repurposing world, if we could figure out a way to get this really humming, we could reduce overall healthcare costs significantly to allow us to be able to treat more patients in different ways and make people healthier. So that's always been our driving goal, is improve outcomes and reduce costs at the same time through repurposing. It's definitely possible if the government and others would, you know, step in and help us to make it more of a reality.
Thanks. Can I add one more? Do we have a minute?
We do. Go ahead.
So kind of branching off that idea. So I know this is on rare diseases, but my mind goes to computational techniques and technologies that those are available to any group, you know, not just rare disease groups. And I see a couple of years, as you mentioned, it's going to be accelerated development across the space, no matter what industry you're in, really. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that translates to faster development times, you know, more quality results, shorter clinical trial times. And do you think there's a direct translation there to cost, just if the speed of development increases?
I wish I could answer that question, yes, Chris, but if I was a pharmaceutical company, if I could get to the market in 8 years instead of 14 years, I don't think I would lower my cost if I didn't have to. Okay. And I'm sad to say that, but right now, you know, other than if I have a philanthropic purpose, what's my motivation if I can bring a drug to the market for $100,000 a year, bringing it to the market at 20,000 or 10,000 or 5,000 just because I can do it faster? We don't have the right kind of competition in this. It's not like in the technology world where if I bring a phone and you have a better one, you can bring it in and charge 20% less. We don't get that kind of competition. What we might see, Chris, is somebody that could bring a competitive drug to the market much more quickly and cost effectively and could underprice the high priced drug. And we may see that happen. You know, I'd be glad to see that kind of race to the bottom where we could do that kind of thing. But I don't foresee it happening but anytime in the future without some kind of regulatory changes.
All right, thanks. So let's hope for some competition.
Thank you. Yeah. Kevin, I think I see an interesting comment here. I'm going to let you have the last question. Would you like to raise your thought about what went on at Nord?
Sure. I'd actually like to comment on the last comment, which is I think if companies could get their drugs out there in 8 years, they wouldn't have to charge the prices they do to cover it. And
I agree. They wouldn't have to. They wouldn't have to. But if you think about it right now, I don't think that argument that we have to charge $200,000 a year to cover the cost, when they're making the kinds of profits they're making, that's sort of disingenuous. I do think it's a risky business to be in there, and pharmaceutical companies, listen, more power to them. I'm a big supporter of the pharmaceutical industry. If you don't want them to charge $200,000 a year, find a different way. A lot of European countries and others, don't let them charge that much. They control prices.
Yep.
Go ahead, ask your question.
So my question, I was at NORD last week, and somebody raised a question about a generically available drug that they've done the work, they've done the trials, just as you've talked about here, and they've shown that it works. But it's not generic in the sense that it's $3 like aspirin. It's still expensive for people, and there's no way to get reimbursement unless you get it on label. Now, how do you get it on label when there's multiple owners of that label?
Right. So I've talked to several people at the FDA about this. There are ways to do it, and we're actually working on one right now. And so I'm hoping in a year from now, I'll be able to report back we were successful. But basically, this FDA group said, if you come to us with all the data you have right now, we'll tell you if there's anything else you need. And if there's not, all you need to do is go get one of the generic drug makers to come and be a sponsor, and then we can get it on label. And you don't have to do any more research if we think you have enough, and you don't have to spend a lot of money. And because you're a nonprofit, we can give you a discount on the fees there. This is one division of the FDA. I can't say that all divisions of the FDA would do that, but I think that's possible. But also, in answer to your question, here's what we have seen in situations where we've repurposed a generic but expensive drug like sirolimus, is that at the beginning there's a lot of back and forth between the patient, doctor, and insurance company, and for the most part they don't pay for it at the beginning. But then they see how the use of this drug is bringing down hospitalization and other costs. And in almost every situation we've been involved in, within 3 to 6 months, the insurer starts paying for the off-label use of this drug because it's completely changing the economics of that particular patient's disease outcome. It doesn't always happen, but and it's unfortunate that that's the system we have, that there isn't an easier way to do this, but that's what happens most of the time. But I agree with you, finding a simple way to get on label for these off-label uses would be a really great thing and be very helpful in getting reimbursement.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Bloom. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Dr. Molina-Pachon. And thank you, everyone, for being with us today. This was a really great discussion, and we'll be planning some more in the course of the cold, cold winter ahead. Dr. Bloom, do you have any final comments you'd like to make before we sign off?
This is great. Some of the questions were, about the posting of the slides. They're available. I'm also happy. My number's on the back end. If somebody wants to get in touch with me by email or phone, happy to answer any additional questions. I'm involved with and on the advisory board for the rare disease part of the Westchester Biotech Initiative. And so, I'm available as a resource. And I really appreciate everybody that joined today and your interest in this area. If we all work together, I think we can make some huge impact. And so knowing there's other people out there interested in this is really great.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bloom. Dr. Molina-Pachon, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, I joined to Bruce's words. I think these are very exciting times, and seeing how many people from very different backgrounds are gathering together and getting into the rare diseases drug development is really interesting. I think that we're going to see in the next 5 years a complete revolution of this particular market with the entry of more and small companies, and that is going to change the scenario a lot. So the market will not be controlled just by the big ones, and this will help patients a lot, I think, which is the important thing at the end of the day. So very exciting times to be around the rare diseases.
Well, thank you so much. You've definitely inspired a movement. And thank you to Chris. Thank you to everybody who's been here. And you'll be hearing from us again soon. Have a great day.